Underneath of this concept of debt versus risk is opportunity. We use both of these tools, debt and risk, to seek out more opportunities. I decided that I was going to take a bet on Hacker Valley and ultimately pursue this full time. This came with a lot of risk, but it also came with debt in its own sense. Taking calculated risks on yourself, I think, accrues manageable debt.
Who says tech can't be human?
What's going on, Hacker Valley fam? Welcome back to the show. I wanted to do a solo episode. I wanted to do a solo episode and talk to you about a concept that's been on my mind lately: debt versus risk. Debt versus risk is a concept that doesn't just affect all of us in cybersecurity like you and I, but it affects every facet of our professional and our personal lives. Professionally, debt versus risk shows up and manifests when you're selecting a new career path, when you're starting a new business, like I've started with Hacker Valley, and also when you're introducing a new security program strategy. One of the security program strategies that I've implemented several times over again are SOAR, Security Orchestration, Automation, and Response, and also Attack Surface Management, which I have the book for and just wrote. Would love for you to check it out on the O'Reilly platform. And when you look at debt versus risk from a personal perspective, one of the big milestones that comes up in life is buying a house or starting a new relationship, moving to a new city. These are all situations where you have to explore debt versus risk. So you're probably wondering, why is debt versus risk on my mind? It's on my mind because of the recent SharePoint breach. The recent SharePoint breach, which I have an article for, it outlines how DHS and several other federal U.S. organizations and agencies were impacted by a major cyber intrusion where attackers were exploiting a Microsoft SharePoint vulnerability. This exploit was attributed to none other than our Chinese state-aligned hacking groups. And Microsoft, they issued a patch a few months back, and they're actively working with all of the organizations and entities that were affected by this breach. And the article also says that there's been no other evidence besides the initial breach that DHS is impacted. This is wild and crazy. SharePoint has been around forever. It's been one of the first forum enterprise solutions that I've worked with. You know, there's many others out there now that have gotten their start from the idea of SharePoint having kind of a wiki, a living and breathing document of how your organization works or how your workflows work. This story brings up the concept of debt versus risk in my mind because these government agencies and also organizations that were affected by this, they perceive the risk of upgrading as greater than staying put. So what happened ultimately? The agencies, they accumulated tech debt and they probably didn't reassess. You know, usually when you make the decision of accepting a risk, it's for a limited amount of time. At least hopefully. We should definitely be going back and reevaluating our decisions. You know, if I take a risk to cross a risky bridge one day, that doesn't mean I want to invest my time and my safety in crossing that bridge over and over again. And I'm sure that this is the case. They didn't necessarily think about the risk and how the risk further escalates over time. The takeaway here is risk avoidance. It often leads to deeper forms of debt. It often leads to lack of security, issues with your operational processes, and it can create a divide in your culture because people do like using the latest and greatest features. So let's back up a bit. Let's talk about two definitions, right? We're talking about risk versus debt. So risk, if you want to break it out into simple terms, is the potential for exposure, failure, or compromise. But, usually when you think of risk, you typically think of reward. A lot of the times when you take a risk, you are fully expecting a more favorable outcome on the other side. And the definition for debt is the accumulated consequences of deferred decisions, especially technical or procedural ones. We've all seen the accumulation of consequences from a monetary perspective. But when it comes to technology and cybersecurity, which cybersecurity, there is definitely debt. That's why a lot of people are investing in cybersecurity insurance. But with cybersecurity, especially in technology, the accumulated consequences of deferred decisions leads to complexity in your code. It leads to slow and it's a grind movement of upgrading your systems and processes. I've worked with many financial institutions and they have many deferred decisions that they put on a change log where you pretty much put in a request and you have to get it reviewed. And then ultimately that request is either accepted or rejected or asked for more revisions. When I worked with financial institutions, we use change management systems, and this really slowed down the opportunity for risk, but it also increased the opportunity for technical debt because you're a lot slower to upgrade. When it comes to debt versus risk in cybersecurity and how this dynamic influences decision making in security or even engineering, it's usually quantified. There's always a cost associated with everything, whether it's your personnel, your technology, or the risk that you're accepting. Before accepting any risk, you want to know what are the short-term and long-term consequences. Neither can be too great. If the short-term consequence is too great, why would I take it? It's going to suck. If the long-term consequence is too great, then it might not hurt now, but it's going to really hurt later, kind of like this SharePoint vulnerability. And when it comes to risk, you really want to know the cost because maybe you can augment the responsibilities of solving the risk to other people or technology at a lower cost. Many of us that use MSPs or MSSPs, we use them because they already come with the expertise. It's going to be less of a headache and an investment to try to hire a team. I'm going to outsource that capability. I'm going to outsource my security threat hunting or threat intelligence. But in other situations, maybe you are a Fortune 500 company, that might not be the best look. It might be more costly to pay an agency than to hire and build out a security practice. So let's take a look at debt versus risk from a personal standpoint. I talked about buying a house or starting a company. Well, I started my company full time. I've really started it twice, but the second time I started Hacker Valley and further invested in it was when my wife was pregnant with our first daughter. I was also switching off of a very high paying cybersecurity job and bringing in over $200,000. And I decided that I was going to take a bet on Hacker Valley and ultimately pursue this full time. This came with a lot of risk, but it also came with debt in its own sense. Every decision that you make is going to accrue risk and debt. But in the case of Hacker Valley, the risk that I was taking was not receiving a similar salary right out the gate. I knew it was going to take some time to build up the company, especially if I'm fully replacing my salary. That's just one of the costs of doing business is building out your team, ultimately making sure that they get paid and things run smoothly, and then increasing over and over and over again. With the risk that I took, I was risking also for a reward. I was wanting to be rewarded more time to focus on the things that I thought were important and to speak to people that I'm very passionate when speaking to and connecting with people in my own specific way. Now, everyone has bosses. My bosses are my clients. My bosses are you all, the ones that are listening to this episode. So I was also taking a risk that my new boss would be better than my old boss. And it turns out I really lucked out when it came to that. And I want to also talk to you about the debt that I accrued when I started Hacker Valley, because there was a major risk, major reward, but there was also short-term and long-term debt. I kind of already mentioned the short-term debt. It was my salary and replacing that. Now, the long-term debt that I have is now I can't get out of it. I'm going to have to really make sure that I build the right thing and make sure I constantly scrutinize it over and over and over again. Because once you start a business and you're supporting many people, it's not trivial to get out. So there's debt that you accrue in that way. But also, as an entrepreneur, you always hear other entrepreneurs say, they spend a lot of time in their craft. So you also accrue some personal debt. You got to make sure that you take time off. That's ultimately how you pay off some of that debt, is by going on vacation, spending time, meaningful time with yourself, your friends, your family, and your community. Taking calculated risks on yourself, I think, accrues manageable debt. And I say that because a lot of us have been in a position at one point in our life, in our career, where we weren't necessarily enjoying what we were doing, whether it be a relationship or our job. We weren't enjoying it and we were comfortable. That is where you can also accrue some debt, is by being too comfortable, not pushing yourself. And that unchallenged growth can lead to stagnation over time. We've all experienced it. We've all seen this, and it's tough. That is why I think that this SharePoint vulnerability ultimately affected so many agencies. We got comfortable. We thought we could take on a risk, and the debt was actually outrageous. This comes from having a continuous learning mindset. And in cybersecurity, there's so many frameworks and strategies that now have the word and term continuous in the front. And that's for a good reason, because continuous anything, but especially continuous learning, leads to discovery. So if you're ever taking a risk or ever accruing debt, it should be a one-time thing. It's a one-time thing because you accept it for that day or for that week or for that year, and then you reassess. We all have to have the capacity and the desire to ask questions and learn. That's how we continuously learn. And that's also how we spot hidden costs. One of the hidden costs that we have all dealt with is buying a cybersecurity solution. We know it's going to increase our efficiency. It's going to lead to so much opportunity. But one of the hidden costs is time to onboard. Time to onboard is always tough because it does take time. A lot of technology, especially in cybersecurity, is very technical. And you also need to work with other teams to integrate. So that's a hidden cost that you constantly can discover by asking questions. One of the hidden costs in our personal life is often time. Time is used by everyone and everything that we do. When we are looking at our day, there's a very popular quote that says that we overestimate what we can do in a day, but we underestimate what we can do in a year. I think that's true, so true, especially in my life, because in my day, if you see my calendar, I think I could do everything. I'm trying to be everywhere. I'm trying to do everything, but I know that I can't. That's one of the areas that I could personally grow, is spotting those hidden costs of how long tasks actually take, because it's hard to guess that sometimes. But over a year, you never know. We often underestimate what we can do in a year. And I think that we often underestimate what we can do in our cybersecurity roles after 1 year. We're thinking about changing things now, but what about changing things a year from now or 2 years from now? We should always be asking questions. Why are we doing things a specific way? And, setting a time to ask that again. And there's a tactful way that you can ask questions. One of the most tactful ways that I've seen that works on me, because people sometimes do it, is they say, help me understand how we got to this place. Sounds collaborative. I'm in. Or, what are we ignoring? What are we not seeing? That one is a little bit more confrontational, but still leads to someone wanting to collaborate and share their specific insights. Underneath of this concept of debt versus risk is opportunity. We use both of these tools, debt and risk, to seek out more opportunities. The first home that I bought it and I took out a loan, and I did it because of the opportunity to call a place my own, to paint the walls however I wanted, to maybe someday rent it out. That was a huge reward that I saw by taking on risk and debt. In cybersecurity, betting on myself to speak about concepts, topics, and people, and ultimately build a business out of it is a risk I took for the opportunity to do things creatively, which, I ultimately wanted to. When you look at risk and debt, both, these are things that you should never avoid. These are things that you should try to understand, that you should stay curious about and constantly ask why. So reflect for a moment and let me know what was an area in your life or your team where you've been avoiding risk and is creating debt. Let us know in the comments or wherever you're listening or watching. And with that, we'll see you on the next one, Hacker Valley fam.